So let's use the framework developed in this previous video, along with these or data from 3 published papers, peer-reviewed papers, to answer the question of how or why are newer varieties, modern varieties of corn, much higher yielding than older varieties of corn that were released in Ontario. In other words, why are higher yielding modern hybrids higher yielding and modern? So we're going to first look at a study done by a retired corn physiologist named Tice Tolinar. He did this experiment at the Aurora Research Station in 1987 and 88, so before many of us were born. And again, the way scientists test the pure effect of G, that G component, independent of interactions with environment or management, is to grow different varieties of corn released, or different crop varieties, doesn't have to be corn, released over a 40 or 50 year time span. They grow those varieties with the same management in the same location, so they're experiencing the same weather. And so then you can test the pure effect of G on grain yield. So that's what Tolinar did, 9 different varieties. And you can see here the effect of G. So on the x-axis, we have the year of introduction, so when that corn hybrid was released commercially in Ontario. And on the y-axis, we can see grain yield. And you don't really need to know this, but there's a difference here. Tolinar shows both total grain yield and machine harvestable grain yield. So total grain yield would be something that would probably include, going back and hand harvesting or collecting all the kernels and all the cobs that could have been missed by the combine. And so often combines will not collect, say, smaller kernels, like very small kernels, or maybe ears that are very small will be missed by the combine. And so total grain yield is often higher than machine harvestable grain yield, especially if there's smaller kernels and much smaller ears involved. So just looking at this graph, it is clear that there is a pure G effect on grain yield. So holding everything constant, E and M, just newer varieties of corn are just higher yielding. And so why or how are they higher yielding? Let's go back to those 3 possible avenues of yield improvement from the last video. Going back to our yield equation, we can ask, are modern, newer hybrids of corn higher yielding because they're intercepting and absorbing more photosynthetically active radiation? So here we have a leaf area index, which we covered in a previous video. And if you don't remember it, please go back and watch my old videos. This is an important concept from these lectures. So we have leaf area index, which serves as a proxy for absorption of intercepted photosynthetically active radiation. Tice Tolinar grew these plants at 4 different densities. We'll just focus on the most commercially relevant planting density. Farm fields are planted around 9 plants per meter squared, and so let's focus on 8 plants per meter squared. So here we have LAI in the rectangle, that red rectangle. Varieties are ranked from oldest to newest, and we can observe almost no variation. I mean, some varieties have higher leaf area index, some varieties have slightly lower, but this is not a stats course. If you look at the LSD, or least significant difference, I mean, you don't have to know what this means, but essentially no statistically significant difference in leaf area index in newer varieties of corn. So let's look at that next component of the yield equation, radiation use efficiency. So Tolinar did another study looking specifically at changes in radiation use efficiency between older and newer varieties of corn. It's a more complicated measurement, so he didn't use 9 varieties of corn here. He just used 1 old variety, Pride 5, and 1 new variety, Pioneer 3902, which he grew at 2 different plant densities, either 8 or 5 plants per meter squared, while Pride 5 was grown at 7 plants per meter squared. Okay, so what Tolinar did was measured radiation use efficiency at different periods after silking or pollination. So from silking to 2 weeks post-silking, 2 to 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, and then over the whole post-silking period from silking to 6 weeks after silking. And looking at radiation use efficiency, we can see this was a significant increase in radiation use efficiency between the older Pride 5 and the newer Pioneer hybrid. And so, based on this study, we can conclude that after silking, radiation use efficiency is greater in those more modern hybrids. So the first part of the yield equation, radiation use efficiency multiplied by the proportion of PAR absorbed by that crop from planting to harvest, that expression is equal to total crop growth. And so we can ask the question, do modern hybrids actually grow larger? Do they have a greater total biomass accumulation? In other words, is this component of the yield equation increasing? And so that's what another one of Tolinar's papers did. He looked at total dry matter, total crop biomass at different phases of plant development. And again, what we see is that we have significantly larger increases in crop growth in the newer hybrids in that later period of growth. So from 3 weeks post-silking to maturity is when we get a real difference in total crop growth. So what Tolinar is showing here in this table is total crop growth, total biomass accumulation in different hybrids from oldest to newest across different phases of development. Okay, so this is just total dry matter from planting to 1 week before silking, 1 week before to 3 weeks after, and then 3 weeks post-silking to maturity. And I think the important thing to note here is that while there are significant differences, again, you can see through the letters significant differences in total growth, so the size of that crop. But you can see that the biggest difference between older and newer hybrids of corn in terms of biomass accumulation or dry matter accumulation is in the 3 weeks post-silking to maturity. So it seems like during that phase of grain fill after silking, that's when we have a real strong genotype effect on biomass accumulation. Now let's look at the last component of that yield equation, harvest index, the proportion of total crop growth or biomass that's allocated to the grain. So again, we have the 9 varieties from oldest at the top, Pride 5, to newest, the Pioneer 3902, newest for 1988, or 1987 rather, and harvest index at different plant densities. And the key takeaway here is that, at that typical planting density, say between 4 and 8, there's not a huge difference in harvest index across these varieties. So it doesn't seem like harvest index increased very much. A small amount, but not necessarily significantly. And so harvest index is not a huge reason why modern corn varieties are higher yielding than older ones. The difference is just too small here. Okay, let's look at that second avenue of yield improvement, which is better matching development and phenology of that crop to the given climate. So maybe newer corn hybrids are just better adapted to Ontario growing conditions. That could be by, for example, changing the rate of leaf development and having more or fewer total leaves, by changing total time to maturity, or the duration of vegetative growth versus reproductive growth, etc. So let's explore that here. So in table 1 on the left, you can see a column for final leaf number, so the total maximum number of leaves that hybrid achieved. And we can see some statistically significant differences here between the oldest and newest hybrids. That might be contributing to changes in leaf area index. And so, there's something going on here, although it seems very minor. Okay. The next column to notice here is the OCHU accumulation required to move that crop from planting to silk emergence, that last column there. So OCHU, that stands for Ontario Corn Heat Unit. Modern days, we just call it CHUs, or corn heat or crop heat units. And Professor McAuliffe showed you a map of Ontario and OCHU accumulation across the province in an earlier lecture. And so here we can see that, the growing degree, or the CHU requirements to move from planting to silking, which is basically, vegetative growth. So the duration of vegetative growth, because silking is the onset of reproductive growth, that has not changed very much. Okay, there's no clear trend here. There's some statistically significant differences, but you can't say that modern hybrids have a longer or shorter duration of vegetative growth. There's nothing really consistent here, and these differences, I should say, are quite minor. So in the middle of summer, 100 OCHU difference would be the equivalent of about 3 or 4 calendar days. So nothing too major. Okay, so now let's go to table 2, where we have again these different corn hybrids and the amount of OCHUs, Ontario corn heat units, required to move that crop through different stages of development. So I have circled in the middle, not circled, but in a rectangle, from planting to a kernel moisture of 28%, 28 grams per kilogram, or 280 grams per kilogram. So this is basically from planting to black layer or maturity. And again, we can see some statistically significant differences in OCHU accumulation required to reach maturity, but nothing major. There's no clear trend really. And so, I don't think there's too much going on here. But Tolinar also breaks down the OCHU accumulation, the amount of heat that crop needs to experience to move from silking to maturity. So basically, the duration of reproductive growth. And again, there might be something going on here. There's some differences statistically, but nothing consistent. So let's move to our third potential avenue for yield improvement, which is changes in density tolerance. So let's remember that as plant density increases, that is the number of plants per meter squared, which has been increasing in corn over the past 30 or 40 years. As plant density increases, plants increasingly compete for light, nutrients, water, and their growth rate slows down. So on a plant basis, yield might be declining, although on a crop basis or per area of land basis, that increase in density results in higher per area yields. So what's going on at the plant level, okay, with changes in density as density increases? Well, under stress, density stress, again, competing for light, water, and nutrients, plants will just not develop reproductive organs. Okay, so they will not set ears or spikes or panicles or pods unless plant growth rate is above a certain threshold. So basically, unless that plant reaches a certain size by the onset of pollination, it either will or will not set, fertile ovules, for example. So if individual plant growth rate declines below some threshold, then that reproductive organ will abort and become non-viable. And so there's good evolutionary reasons for this regulation, right? If you're a plant living out in the savannah and you say, hey, I'm not growing very quickly, I'm not growing very large, this year's a bad year. You know what? I'm gonna cut my losses. I'm not going to reproduce this year. I'm not gonna set any seeds because that takes a lot of energy, right, to produce seeds. This is not a good year. I'm gonna wait till next year and do it again, maybe next year. And so that is what, evolutionarily, why plants will just not set seeds if the stress, whatever density stress, is too high. So if density tolerance is increasing across, eras, hybrid eras, and newer hybrids, what that means is that, that plant can be smaller, it cannot grow as quickly, but still be able to actually set seed and set a lot of seed. It's not as sensitive to this density stress. So this is research, again, done in Ontario using, Ontario corn genetics, done by my old office mate, Hugo Gonzalez, who's now working for Corteva in Argentina. And so what he did was he grew different genotypes of corn in Ontario, and he measured per plant dry matter accumulation and per plant harvest index. Okay, so here you have 4 different corn genotypes. This is a graph from one of his papers. On the x-axis is per plant dry matter accumulation, so the weight or mass of that plant. And on the y-axis, you have harvest index. And so the important thing to note here is look at that x-intercept. So here we have the two x-intercepts from two different varieties or genotypes. One red arrow, one green arrow. And the x-intercept here shows the minimum PDMA required to have a harvest index of greater than 0. In other words, the minimum plant mass required for that corn plant to set grain, to have a harvest index, above 0. So the variety with the red arrow, that variety has a minimum PDMA requirement of about, let's say, 42 grams per plant. So below 42 grams per plant, that variety will not set seed. Okay, it'll have a harvest index of 0. It needs greater than 42 grams to actually have a harvest index. That variety in green, with the green arrow, has a minimum PDMA requirement of, let's just call that 30 grams per plant. So that variety needs to be at least 30 grams per plant to actually have a harvest index greater than 0. So what this study, Hugo's study, shows, as well as many, many others, is that varieties differ in their tolerance to density stress, and newer hybrids are indeed more tolerant of density stress. And so that is one avenue of this increase in yield, just increased density tolerance, leading to farmers able to increase planting or seeding rates, increasing yield on a per area basis. So this has been a pretty long video. Let's wrap it up. So in conclusion, why in Ontario corn production, why are modern high-yielding varieties higher yielding? What are those pathways of yield improvement? What are responsible for that pure effective G on cropping system productivity? So can we relate it back to the yield equation? Yes, we can. Total growth, yes. Newer varieties have greater biomass accumulation, especially in that later part of grain fill, and that's attributed to increases in radiation use efficiency, not so much changes in interception or absorption of photosynthetically active radiation as we measured via LAI. It's really this increase in radiation use efficiency that's driving this increase in total growth, total biomass. Did harvest index change much over in newer varieties? A little bit. I would say, not a huge contributor to this increase in yield that we saw at the start of this video. So harvest index did increase slightly, but it's not a major contributor to this overall increase in yields. Now, let's think about phenology. So did things like the duration of vegetative growth, of reproductive growth, the rate of leaf appearance, did those things change in modern hybrids, newer hybrids relative to older ones? And the answer is pretty much no. There's some statistically significant differences there, but no real clear trend, and probably did not contribute very much. Then our last avenue of yield improvement, do modern hybrids have better density tolerance? And the answer is yes. And I didn't go through all the studies, but there's a number of Ontario studies, including Hugo's, that show that modern hybrids have better density tolerance. And so we can think of what are the most important pathways of yield improvement for corn. That's something you may be asked. Okay, we're done.